On to chapter 2. This will give you some insight into different families and family styles and how they're raised and structure. And not only is insights into families that you'll work with, but might give you some insight into you and how you became to you by some of the structures also of your family. So hopefully it'll give you an awareness. I don't know if it gives you power to change a lot, but it might help you understand how people come to you, the kids come to you from different areas, different needs, different thoughts, and things like that. And so I hope you enjoy this. The diversity of families. And again, Ms. Rojas Cortez has something for you. Respect and value from teachers and administrators will help diverse families achieve emotional well-being. And it's not only diverse families, but it's all. And you know, it's a big part of teachers and their understanding. My kids, like many, really put a lot of value in if the teacher likes them or not. And you know, it has a lot to do with their learning. One of the things we do as parents, and you will also, is we'll evaluate teachers by how our kids like them, and of course from their communications and what they have to do with us. But this chapter on diversity will take you on some areas that are somewhat new. Here's the things off the wiki also. Define the term family, and the test will take you right over that, the term family, and identify different types of families, and examine different functions of the family and parenting styles, and I'll ask you to do some of that. Discuss greater involvement of the fathers. There's a big section in this chapter about that. Discuss how poverty and homelessness affect today's families, and I have some insight on that that is politically incorrect. So let's talk first about what is the family. And this is exactly the question on the test. A group of two or more people who reside together, who are related by birth. While a household, different between a family and a household, can be all the people occupying that house. Now I'll give you an example. One of my sons, a family on our baseball team, they took in a kid that had some huge issues that was not related and really didn't have anything to do with him. A kid they met and worked with for a while and was having so much trouble getting along at home that they invited him in to live in their house. He dropped out of school, he had all kinds of issues, but he was part of their household, but they would never consider him part of their family because he wasn't connected. So this is really a society construct concept of what is the family. And so here's that overview. Types of families, functions, parenting styles, father involvement, and transitions. So first of all, who are related by birth, marriage, or what have you, or you know, different from a household is anybody that lives there. And it's socially constructed, meaning there is no real structure of this. It's simply constructed by society. So here's the stages of family life, and you'll have, why this is important to you is so that you can have a sense of where families are at when they're when you're working with them. This in the textbook talks about this. Society depends on the families, and you'll hear people talk about this, that this is part of the breakdown for society, is the breakdown of the families, that the family structure has so changed. And it has some insight here on that, on how that's changing, and the image, just the images here tell you how the family is changing. When you see this picture here as a family, dramatically different than how we would portray it in the past. And that's how the family has changed. So let's go back and look at these stages in the textbook of it. Stages. And what I want you to do is make one line for each of these. It takes you right through these steps. And in here, one line for each of these of what these mean. So here, one here, one here, one here. One line so that you have a guidance there of these stages of image making, nurturing, authority, guidance, independent, those things. Okay, and it's right here in the textbook. we go into the diversity of family. But first I want to look at this parenting life cycle. And here's what I know about parenting life cycles, types of families here. Single parent, a teenage parent, functions of those families. And here's those parenting styles that I talked about. And again, I'm going to ask you to come in here and talk a little bit about which of these are. Okay. When you look at these under the discussion here on this, I want you to tell me what parenting style you were raised under after you understand the parenting style, and I'll weigh in on this here also. But that's under this on week 2, chapter 2, week 3 discussion is part of that, and it lays it out pretty good here on this. Functions of families. I'll back up here, but here's the parenting styles, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, and again, you identify how you were raised based on what you learn about this here, and comment on the discussion on that part of it. Let me go back now. I jumped through this pretty fast. These different ones here, we're going to take an in-depth look at this a little bit later, and I'm going to ask you to be part of this on your wiki project. But I want you to also, on page 22, there's some insights here that I want you to bring in here, and just give me a one-liner of these implications of knowing those different things here. So here's quite a bit here in this blue, one line, and it's short lines about it. The different knowing these different family structures. Okay, then the functions of the family. What are actual functions? And it lays it out up here what those functions are: nurturing, guiding, problem solving, modeling, monitoring the child's development as a learner. First function of the family is to nurture by supplying the basic needs. This is not new to you. Part of the understanding cultural differences, having knowledge of how parents socialize their children. And it goes through that. It talks about, how important our elders are important in a lot of the cultures, but in some cultures it's even more, even within cultures. And that's the part I think we miss often in working with different families and different cultures, is how much difference we can have within cultures that we ignore. That still the highest percentage of people in the country are white, and yet how different we are from one group to another, that never is part of this study. We get so hung up on, that even culturally we're a lot more alike than we're different, but we never really talk about that. Not politically correct thing to do. So here, when you get through this stuff, you give me one line about each of those implications here. And here's that thing, what they do. And you'll know that. And there's some questions on the tests about these different functions. And this is, I think this is always interesting, because this is where we see sometimes in our low-income families that some of these things get missed because they're struggling to provide these basic needs. Yes, again, politically incorrect to have that conversation. So here's the parenting styles. That's authoritative and authoritarian. Two different ones. And then the laissez-faire and the dysfunctional. Okay. Comment on that. And insights on page 24 look like this. I'm not going to make you bring those in, but I want you, promise me you'll read through those implications for teachers, insights for teachers and administrators on that page. And then we get into the fathers and see what it says about that. It's father involvements. Negative aspects of being raised without a father. Without the father. And this is not new. It's well documented. 3 times more likely to fail at school. Okay, this is what should alarm you. And again, as a teacher, you don't get to change this. If there's not a father present, this is what I think our federal government forgets sometimes. They think they can alter this. If there's not a father present, and there's not a father present. And so you just know this, and this is why we look at this and study this. You're 3 times more likely to fail at school, 2 to 3 times more likely to experience emotional or behavioral problems. Ruh-roh. Okay, I can verify my years of teaching without a doubt that this to be true, that I worked with a lot of kids that had behavior problems, that there was not a strong presence of a father. Almost to the point of requiring psychiatric treatment. The student is 3 times more likely to commit suicide as adolescents. 5 times more likely to be poor. That's why it's important to be the fathers there. So here's some research on father involvement. It may help offset negative effects of child involvement when mothers are not as supportive. More physical style of interacting with children supports and adds to the nurturing and verbal style of the mother. Okay, and this is the part that I think people forget, and we've had some interesting conversations at our house about this. Fathers are different. They interact different. The mother is that supportive, nurturing, loving, encouraging, and the father says, get off your butt and try harder. Oh yes, that's alarming to the mother, but especially boys need that kind of kick in the rear end sometimes, or they're going to have some other issues. Okay, so they're different. This is what I think will be challenging about a marriage is changing and families changing where there is not the father present, or there's 2 fathers or 2 mothers. I know, politically incorrect, don't throw anything at me, but I think it's a challenge to families, and yet not supposed to talk about it, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. High levels of father involvement indicate positive outcomes on cognitive and social emotional development. Okay, and sometimes there's reasons beyond control why there's no fathers present, but now it's very acceptable in our culture to intentionally not have father present, to intentionally become single mothers and single parents. And so you don't get to change that as a teacher. You just become aware of it, that their needs may be different if there's not a father present. So here's some insight on how to involve fathers, like father extends to all father figures. And I think this is a great insight for researchers, is that it doesn't have to be the biological father, that a male figure can be the grandfather. It can even be an uncle or a big brother or a neighbor, somebody that represents that father figure in this. And that's one of the things our church have done, is try and reach out to the families and become father figures to some of the families that don't have a father present. And for you to reach out to the fathers as much as mothers and encourage the father participation in meetings, activities. Appreciate the father's contribution. Now, knowing this, it sounds easy, and of course you would easily give that a thumbs up, but as we're going to study a little bit later on, sometimes if blended families or after families have broke down, these things become a whole lot harder to do. So, and here's some suggestions for fathers. I'm never quite sure what this means. Be there. Yeah. And family transitional things like divorce and blended families. And you're familiar with these things. That divorce, your economic status of parents who divorce changes dramatically. That your 24.6% of all custodial parents and their children had incomes below the poverty level in 07. What does that mean? 25%, 1/4 of the families, if it's a single parent family, lives below the poverty line. They relate more to previous situation and subsequent events that affect the child than divorce itself. Meaning the divorce is hard, but it's what comes after that. Again, you don't change this. If there's problems in the marriage, had nothing to do with you, but the children may need a different consideration. Depends on relationship of parents post-divorce, meaning after, in that separation. And I think of that in our house, and I've been married to the same woman for a long time. How it would shatter my kids not to have us both sleep in there each night. How it completely changes the family structure. Okay. Relationship with the custodial parent and the non-residential parent. And of course, we talked about this, the big changes, economics often changes. And at the very least, think of this. In our house, that we're both work and provide for our family, but if all of a sudden one of us, the mother or the father, need to go set up a residence someplace else and start a whole new household, that alone is a financial drain on the family that they can't withstand. So blended families, how do they get into blended families? And of course, we say that can be as many as 30 different configurations, and the family members are not all present at one time. But obvious one is the mom's children, and then of course the dad's children, and then if they have children, which often, I saw a stat one time, happens very often. And then outside ones, and this is if the children don't live there, but they come and stay from time to time. And so there's a lot of different sources of this, and that's what's most common in blended families is they're not all present in the household. They're visitors. And this is what I think creates such havoc in families, is if the family members are visitors. And isn't one of us in this study that doesn't have stories about where some of the family members are visitors, and it could be the father, often the children, and so it creates some interesting dynamics. And for you have to know that may change the dynamics for children that you have in your class from these families when the visitors are there or they're not there. So that's where that's at. Okay. So what about these blended families? Well, they have some stages also. And these researchers here looked at this like a fantasy stage, is where they visualize new families. Kids wish for old family. Then it's immersion, awareness. And let me assure you, the test is going to pick some of these out. And you have to understand what is the fantasy stage, the restructuring phase, the solidifying stage, and how we get to those, during which the airing of difference occurs when we're restructuring as we try and figure this out. And sometimes families don't make it. And you all are aware of that also, that the second marriage doesn't work out. Much higher rate of divorce for second marriages than first. And why? Because of this right here. This restructuring, this trying to re-blend the family. My father-in-law married after his wife, my mother-in-law, passed away many, many years before she was my mother-in-law, many years ago. Married a woman with children much younger, and even as adults, the children were all adults when they married, and I'm telling you, still is, I think, is the biggest pressure on that marriage is the adult children. And then we get into this thing about headed by grandparents. And before we get to there, let me just back up a second and flip through the textbook a little more with you. And this is all about father importance and how important they are and their insight. And here's the suggestions for the father that we talked about. And it gives you ideas how you can involve them in the school. And again, promise me you'll read this. I won't make you bring this in, but read this insight for teachers and administrators on working with fathers. And then this was about divorce. It fluctuated between 2000 and 2009, it says here. The thing I think, this is the thing with statistics, is that you can make them do all kinds of things. This down here talks about the rate per thousand, and that's a very politically correct way to look at it. That it actually has decreased a little bit, but what they're not showing you here is the marriage rate has dropped much faster. The marriage rate has dropped much faster. So even though it shows you here that we have a drop in divorce rate, the marriage rate has declined much quicker. A lot more people forming families and households that are not married and raising children. So when we show you this, we're making strides here between 2000 and 2009. Less divorces, but one of the reasons that's politically incorrect to talk about is there's less marriages. And then it goes on here, as we talked about the economic status, how it changes the family. This was in the notes here, economic, financial thing. And then these children's responses, and again, this isn't new to you, respond to the divorce of their parents, even adult children, right? Children of all ages respond to the divorce of their parents, even adult, and sometimes it's very hard on adult children. I found that younger children who suffer the most at the time of divorce, but here this highlighted here, but a 10-year follow-up 10 years after the divorce, older girls still harbored feelings of betrayal and rejection by men, making commitment to their own romantic relationships difficult. Not marriages, to romantic relationships, because the marriage rate has dropped so significantly that they have to study something bigger than marriages. So romantic relationships makes that difficult 10 years later. So generally, though, if the quality of life after divorce was good, children did well. If parents continued to fight over the children or burden their children with too much responsibility, in short, it stressed and caused problems. It says here another thing is not assure children they're not the cause of it. And then it has some insight. Older infants and toddlers realize that one of their parents no longer lives there. Toddlers, preschool, and again some insight. Just read this, please, about the insights. Then the single parent families. Again, there are about 13.7 million single parents in the United States. This here talks about in the last 100 years prior to 1960, they really weren't a statistic because so often they functioned quite well. These single, back then, often men died at a younger age or for whatever reason weren't left the family because of death. Certainly, rarely as divorce. Why they still survived as a family. Mother was widowed. They worked hard to raise their children, taking in boarders, doing laundry, somehow managing to get by. So there are about 13.7 million single parents in the United States, and that's 27% of custodial single mothers, and their children live in poverty. We talked about that earlier. Whereas 12.9, 13 are custodial single fathers, and their children live in poverty. So, that a surprise? So you're much more likely to be in poverty if you live with the mother as a custodial parent versus the father. And what's hard to sort that out is how do you get that statistic? If the family was, what about this? Is the family in poverty before the divorce? Not part of the study. This is how you can skew research. Make statistics tell you what you want it to tell. Don't distinguish whether they were in poverty before the divorce. Okay? That's how you can do it. Then gender differences exist for mothers and fathers. For example, during the period that a mother is raising her children, she has a much higher risk of poverty, of course, because she's working with the children. 12% of single parents who work full-time find themselves in poverty. Okay? And 49% of those who work part-time are in poverty. Almost 74% of single parents who do not work in poverty are in poverty. And 79% of single parents are in the labor force. Okay, let me say it again. 74% of single parents who do not work are in poverty. Go figure. And 79% of single parents are in the labor force, meaning at least part-time. Now, here's the thing that's a little politically incorrect, but they do talk about it here, Ms. Rojas does, and that is most divorced parents do remarry, which then, of course, does change their socioeconomic level again. 80% of children live in two-parent households with reduced risk of poverty. So once they remarry, for whatever reason, that poverty level changes, and that's why the biggest stat is still living with that. So here again is big insights for this. Then the blended families. Talked about what these blended family cycles Here it is, and it takes you through that. And here's insight for that. Okay. Then families headed by grandparents, and that's changed a little bit from what it was. I want to take you here. I took this out of the textbook. It's also the census showed that the number of grandparents maintaining families doubled from 2.2 million in 70 to 4.5 in 2000, and care for grandchildren was maintained by 2.4 million grandparent caregivers. 3.9% of all households in 2000 were grandparent-led. Of these families, 19% had incomes below poverty, even though they're led by the grandparents. These are families in which parents may live with the family, but where the grandparents provide the financial support, different from families who have grandparents who move in with them. And again, I say to you, one of the things that's not distinguished here whatsoever is the fact that a very high percentage of these families were in poverty before the families moved in. And again, so to me it paints kind of a false picture here of they've come in poverty. No, many of these children and grandchildren were born into poverty, didn't go into poverty after birth, were in poverty, were born into families where the grandchild. Here's the thing, families in poverty, the rate, they have a much, much higher incidence of having teen mothers than those that aren't in poverty. So here's what it looked like in my life when I was teaching in the middle school. In my 8th grade homeroom, at least every other year, I would have a student, an 8th grade student, announce to the class that she was expecting a baby. And that age of those girls were 14 to 15 years old. Now, of those, almost without fail, the mothers were in their early 30s. So when we talk about grandparents in this conversation, raising children, in these impoverished families that live below the income line, at least in the ones that I worked with, were not grandparent age. And so that's, again, like I say, so when you look at this, just know that, and that might be your case too, that the grandparents are the heads of the household and they're not grandparent age. They're not grandparent age. And so at least 2 cases I remember in my homeroom girls that I was older than the grandmother. Both were headed by single parent families, by mothers. Both were in their early 30s, and I was older than both of them, and we hadn't started our families yet. So that's some insight into that when it's headed by grandparents. So poverty, according to the income person of a family, implies lack of resources needed to survive. 43 million in the poverty in 2009. 20% of children live in poverty. Okay, so again, let me go back here and talk about poverty. And again, I think there's some agenda stuff here. See, again, it's an area, to me, is so politically incorrect to talk about. You're not supposed to talk about poverty and the effects of that. That's, it just, if you do, it's always with a sympathetic voice. And the thing, again, that Ms. Rojas here refuses to address here is what we call generational poverty. That you'll have kids in your class, if you're in a low-income school, that are 5th, 6th, 7th generation of poverty, meaning that there's nobody in their life that had education or careers or were, you know, in the workforce any more than an entry level. So here it talks about the poverty rates from 59 to 09. Okay, and you see them kind of wiggle here, poverty rate and the number in poverty, and of course they kind of parallel each other. And the higher rate here is because the increase in the population in the United States. All right. Here's what I'm going to have you do right here is I want you to come and tell me what the poverty rate is here for like a family of 4. You put a box and you mark it well in your notes so I can tell that you've looked this up. But find out what the poverty rate, for example, if you wanted free lunches at your school, what your income would have to be below to qualify for these programs. for a family of 4, not 1, not 2, not 3, but a family of 4. Why? Why do they run that out? Because a high percentage of these families come in families of 4, because they often include people that aren't, it could be grandchildren and grandparents and stuff. So right here, you come in and do some insight on that. Here's those charities it was going to go into here, these assistant programs. And really, this is what I think happens to generational poverty sometimes, is that life becomes about these assistance programs instead of getting out of poverty. And that's what I found. And again, throw stones at me, tell on me, whatever, but I worked with so many families that had no desire to change their status, that they didn't know anything other than that lifestyle because they were in their 4th, 5th generation of poverty. Okay. Get into homelessness, which is another thing with poverty. And this is, people associate these as the same, and I want to say to you now, politically incorrect as it is, they are not the same. They are not the same. Okay, poverty's casualties here. It talks about poverty often means they're depressed or powerless to effect change and unable to control one's own destiny. And again, I don't agree with that, that the ones I knew from generational poverty didn't feel that way at all. Going to spare many families together provide the best of their children. Many government agencies such as Administration of Children's and these talks about it. Okay, and here's some implications. Again, please read these, because that might be the strongest part of the lesson, is that this is an interesting way to counteract poverty, decent standard of living, jobs that pay enough to adequately rear children, flexible working conditions so children can be cared for, integrated network of family services, which they list for you, and legal protection for children in those. You don't get to impact those, but and then homelessness. Single mother without home lack more than just housing. Another poor fit homeless single mothers held ever a job for longer than 6 months. And that doesn't always define homelessness. And it talks about this McKinney-Ovento Homeless Education Assistance Acts. And there's actually a question on the test about this. And it goes into this authorized rights of students who are experiencing homelessness. And of course, what it is they're still entitled to their education and their connections. Talks about these concerns for children who experience homelessness. A number of things that comes into play that may be different than others. All right. Talks about here 3.4 million, 23% of homeless population are children. 3 main reasons: affordable housing, poverty, unemployment. Yeah, but again, let me just finish this. Have access to education and the state responsibilities. Lack the security of living in a stable environment. Higher risk of nutritional deficiencies, yes. May suffer from learning difficulties, speech delays. Yeah, and that's a whole bunch of stuff that's not only related to homelessness, but the parenting style stuff. Very hard to parent when you're homeless. Would you agree? What does it have to do with you? Again, you'll look at the connections there, but it has to do with they'll need special consideration of it. But here's what I know about homelessness, and I worked with homeless people. Homeless people, for the most part, is a high percentage of mental illness. And yes, it does involve children, but there is enough assistance now, as we go back and look at the assistance list here, there's enough assistance that I would say without a doubt there's no reason for anybody to be homeless that wants homes because of the assistance. The federal government provides huge amounts of assistance. How homeless comes to be in my world was numbers and numbers of mentally ill people. And the laws have changed. There was a time in the years gone back that if somebody was mentally ill, you could get them committed to a place where they got help and got on medicine and were provided for. But mentally ill people often are very uncooperative. And now the rules have changed that people abuse that. They would take elderly parents and wanted to get rid of them, so they would have them committed and be locked up and cared for by the state. So the laws were changed. So it's very, very hard now to get people committed. The only way you can get them committed to an agency now is if they're a danger to themselves or others. And so a lot of them being very uncooperative and not able to get along with people, and often I say mental illness, we're off their medication, become homeless, become what we call street people. And if you walk among street people, and we don't have a lot in our area, you'll find a high percentage of them are mentally ill and want nothing to do with homes. That some have opportunity to that, but I had one tell me one time, like, to live in a shelter. He said nobody wants to live in a shelter. You have to go in there sometimes when it's cold, but they would much rather live on the street. They don't want anybody to tell them what to do. They don't want anybody making them get a job. That somebody that's mentally ill, for the most part, can't handle a job, and yet they refuse to support in those types of things. They refuse help or any kind of a structure or anything. So that's homelessness. Okay, Chapter 2, the diversity of the family. See what you can do.